The microphone is working?
But there's going to be somebody
There.
there to guide you. He's going to be with you at least until 10:30.
On this. And then I'll find some places. Everything I'm doing is non-destructive, so I can't imagine people will have much time.
1, 2, 3, test. Ça marche.
On est prêt?
Ouais.
Hello everybody. Thanks for coming to the presentation. It's not loud. Ça marche pas? Ça marche pas du tout? Non? Ah non, le micro a arrêté de marcher, je pense. Il n'a jamais marché?
Sinon, c'est lui que Pierre capte.
Ah, ça fonctionne? Ah bon.
All right.
Let me introduce Geoffrey Parker from the Smithsonian Institute in the US. Geoffrey works with LIDAR technology for forest structure. He's got a really nice database of LIDAR measurements at different sites around the world. And he's got a very good understanding of how to characterize structure so that it makes sense for different disciplines, which is not very easy to do. So he's able to characterize structure at relevant scales for the different, to answer different science questions. So here he is, Geoffrey.
Thank you very much, Martin, and to the faculty of the Université Laval. This is like coming home for me because I did my undergraduate in Montreal at McGill. So I want to talk today about the use of LIDAR to measure the structure of forest canopies. And my main interest today is to contrast two very different kinds of LIDAR and to talk about their differences and what you can see with one that you can't see with the other, and in some cases how they are similar and complementary. So I'd like to thank people first, and there's a number of funding sources who have supported this, and lots of people, in particular a large number of volunteers, both at my research site and every place I visited, who have given time. So why bother with this extended discussion of canopy structure and funny ways of measuring it? Well, it's become obvious to a lot of us that canopy structure is key to a lot of things that forests do. In fact, if you know something about canopy structure, you can estimate biomass and growth and the stage of the forest development. You can learn something about atmospheric interactions with the surface. This is a particular specialty of Martin's. And you can also learn something about the habitat inside the forest. All of these things are of interest currently. Now, LIDAR is a great way of getting this information. And if you're not familiar with the capabilities of LIDAR, may I just summarize it by saying it's a way of measuring making large numbers of distance measurements from a known location. And since structure really depends on the location of surfaces in space, this allows you to make summaries of that structure. There's a bunch of kinds of LIDAR, and I'll contrast three of the kinds here. And I want to point out, my main point is that they give different kinds of information. We shouldn't assume that one can give you the other. So my objectives here are to describe the different kinds of LIDAR, talk about their differences, and their differences depend on two classes of issues. One is the geometry of the sensor and the way it's deployed, but also on the part of the canopy structure that the sensor sees. I'll give some examples of how this information can be applied. To learn something about how forests change in time, we use a sequence of forests of the same kind but of known ages. We call that a chronosequence. We have a study of forest structure response to a recent logging event. And then finally, I'll talk about the global survey that Martin alluded to. And again, I'm going to concentrate on the differences and similarities. Oh, just so we can contrast where I am relative to us. This is the East Coast, and CERC, which stands for the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, is associated with the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. And of course, you know where the Quebec City is. So, some sensor types that I'll be discussing. First of all, LIDAR itself stands for light detection and ranging. It's basically using light photons or trains of photons, usually in the infrared, for measuring precise distances to targets. And the methodology for doing that is to measure the time that it takes that photon train to reflect from the target and be received back at a receiver. That's called the time of flight approach. Now, the three kinds I'm going to compare here are airborne laser scanning, which is probably the most familiar to everybody, but also terrestrial laser scanning, which Martin uses a lot, and then finally the system that I've developed and I and several colleagues have used in a number of places. We call it the portable canopy LIDAR. Sometimes I may refer to these by their acronyms. So here's a little example of the different geometries of the three systems. The wavy line in the middle is intended to represent the outer canopy surface. Airborne laser scanning, ALS, works usually from an aircraft, and as the aircraft flies overhead, the laser scans from side to side and gives you a swath in which each pixel is a measurement to a distance. So it's really nice for an aerial view. But you'll notice that because it's doing scanning, the angles are not always directly down below. There is some angle to the side. Usually that's kept to less than 20 degrees, but it can be an effect in some cases. Now we have in the blue the terrestrial laser scanning, or TLS. That is an instrument which is in one place on the ground, and it scans in two angular directions, and each pixel in those cases is a distance to a range. You can use the terrestrial laser scanner to look at the entire canopy, but you have to move it to numerous locations, and then you have the problem of integrating the different views. There are ways to do that, but because of the price of this instrument, the heaviness of it, and the difficulty of deployment, sorry Martin, it's true, this has applications in certain circumstances. My system, portable canopy LIDAR, is held by a person who walks through the forest. The laser rangefinder shoots directly overhead and gets the range to the nearest target overhead. And the idea is that you get a long transect of information about the canopy overhead, and you transform the information on the first hits into information on the internal structure of the forest. So let me just review with some pictures what some of the results of these systems are. Airborne laser scanning has found most use, at least initially, in learning something about ground topography. In fact, the idea is that you make a large number of hits of the ground. The trees are in the way, so you find a way of removing those. My colleague who produced this image calls that process virtual deforestation. And he's a geologist, and he's particularly interested in what's going on in the land here. And in this particular island in the Puget Sound off Washington State, you can see some interesting features that he was interested in. For example, little marks that indicate the recession of a glacier. So anyway, and also you can see some slumping up in the top left of the picture. So initially, people were really interested in ground-based or airborne LIDAR in order to extract high-quality digital elevation models of the ground. And in fact, the accuracy of these is 10 to 100 times better than that of the previous topographic maps. Now, the trees that were removed in order to get the geology, are of course of interest to folks interested in forests. This is a picture of the forests in my area, in Cirque, and they are color-coded by the height above the ground. You can see that this is a landscape that's pretty complicated. It has fields and farms and forests of various kinds. This is exactly what I'm interested in. Here's a blow-up of that. In the upper right, let's see if I can do this. In this area here, we have a plantation of loblolly pine. In this area here, we have a recent logging, and I'll describe that a little bit later. But the forests in this area are varied and multi-species, mostly hardwoods, and they can reach a stature of more than 40 meters. But anyway, this is the newer interest in LIDAR is not just the ground topography, but to learn what's living on top of it. And really, if you take the difference between the ground topography and the topography of the outer surface, then you get something about the stature of the forest. And that's what a lot of people who are using LIDAR for forest applications are doing. Here's an interesting view from a forest in the Pacific Northwest. It's just a small area, but it illustrates some of the things that first excited me about LIDAR. What you can see is this is a young forest here of about 60 or 70 years old. It's mostly Douglas fir. And here is an old growth forest and on the lower left. And you can see there are sort of dramatic differences in the texture of these, both the height and the texture itself. In the middle is a recent clear cut, and you can see that a number of trees have been left along the stream. The law in Washington state requires you to leave a riparian forest. So just looking at this image tells me an awful lot about this forest and the way it's currently being managed. Now let's talk a little bit about terrestrial laser scanning. This again, remember, is where you have a fixed instrument which is making a square view overhead, sometimes a very large square, and each of the pixels in that square is a distance. I'll just show you a couple of examples of how that was used at my site. Here's a very, very young forest, and the distances have been color-coded, so the ones that are close are red, and those that get progressively far away are yellow. You can see the trunks, and you can see the arrangement of this is a leafless forest, actually, but notice down in the bottom left here, you can see some conifer trees, loblolly pine, that were remnant in that particular forest. And this is exceedingly dense information. The files are enormous and take a specialized software to deal with. Another example is a very old forest here, using the same color coding scheme, and this is quite a bit taller. And you can extract lots of information from this, especially about individual tree architecture, and you can use it for developing models for better estimating biomass of trees. And in the case of Martin, he's going to use it to inform models that help us understand atmospheric surface interactions. So now I'll talk a little bit about my system, the portable canopy LIDAR. And this is an older version of it being maintained by a student of mine. It's basically a platform that a person carries in front of him. He has a computer for accessing the data. This is a LIDAR here. Sorry, just a laser rangefinder in front. The mouse is hard to find. Oh, and it shoots at 2,000 observations a second, so that as you're walking along, you get quite a bit of information on the canopy overhead. The newer versions look a little bit better than that. Here's an example of the kind of things you get from that. The top row of panels shows you individual slices acquired with this system overhead. The top three are from a young forest. These are individual slices that are parallel, and the bottom one is a mature forest. When you collect the information from all the slices available, you get a summary of the average vertical structure, and I call that the canopy height profile. And if you can sum across all those levels, you get an estimate of the total amount of surface area overhead. Again, let me be clear about what's going on here. The contours show progressive levels of the surface area density in a particular voxel. So the darker areas are where there's more leaves, and the areas without any color are empty spaces. These two sets of panels illustrate some differences between young and older forests in my area. The young forests all have the material collected at one level, near the top. They tend to be fairly flat. And the older forests have material throughout their height. The top surface is rumpled, and they're quite complicated inside. This is where we start, and there's a variety of other indices that we can extract from this information. And here are some of them. There's an example of one of these, I call them curtains, or they're called height sections. So you can get the maximum height and also the average height of all the surfaces. You can get the average height of the outer surface. That blue line that wiggles across is an example of that rumpled surface that one would see from an airplane flying overhead. An example of the texture of that surface I call the rugosity, and it's simply the standard deviation of the height. You can also find out what fraction of the canopy is holes. You can ask questions about the average amount of surface area. It's related to the leaf area index, but it's not the same because, of course, we don't just have leaves, we have branches and twigs as well. And you can calculate the mean cover, which is basically the fraction of times when your instrument saw the sky and not, sorry, that's the openness. Cover is 1 minus that. You can get the hypsograph. I'll explain what that is. I think it's a useful metric. But anyway, there's a variety of things you can get from this gadget. I think I need to make some definitions when I go to contrast what's going on between the two kinds of LIDAR systems. And one is something called the outer canopy surface. That's really the skin on top of the forest. And I'll show you why I believe that this is actually a real characteristic of forest. The local outer canopy height is basically the distance between the ground and the topmost surface over one point. It's not the top of the tree, it's just the top of the local canopy. And so I call that LOCH. And the hypsograph is the distribution, and I usually express it as a cumulative, of those top heights. So here's the things that I was speaking about in picture form: local outer canopy height, the variability in that, and then also the scale of variation. It's possible to calculate how far away you have to go in horizontal distance before structures are uncorrelated. Again, there's the outer canopy surface. And if we're just concentrating now on the very top surfaces, these local outer canopy heights, we can see that they have a distribution there. And if you look at the cumulative distribution, which we call the hypsograph, it's there. By the way, the hypsograph is a term that comes from landscape geomorphology, and it's basically was invented to look at the shapes of watersheds or basins, and it was discovered that they change in geological time in interesting ways. So now I really want to talk about how the sensor itself and the way it looks at the canopy affects the kinds of metrics that you can acquire. This is a view from a helicopter of the forest where I am, and you can see the helicopter shadow in the lower right. But I would submit, and I have lots of pictures of this sort, that this is a surface, more or less smooth. It's holes, of course, but the individual trees try very hard to fill space, very much like a tile system. And when there is a hole, a gap, it tends to get filled up, either from below or with lateral growth. I call that the outer canopy surface. Now, it's quite distinct from the distribution of material inside the forest. This is a recent edge, and you can see there's material at all levels here, and not just at the top. So we have two contrasting views. Here's another example of a forest where you can see material at various heights. So I'm contrasting two different views. The one at the top, which is more or less continuous surface, and the view from below looking up, which is a collection of blobs. Now, how do you compare the two views of the canopy? Well, you need to use the same LIDAR instrument in the same forest at the same time. Now, I was able to take advantage of a crane that was situated in a forest in central Leipzig, Germany, and the crane allowed me to do a transect above the canopy, and then on the same day in the afternoon, I went and did a transect below the canopy looking up. And I think the registration was pretty good in many cases. But whether or not that's true, we're still looking at the same collection of objects, and we can get statistical pictures. Well, that was cool. Anyway, here's an example of one transect taken from both the crane from above and from the ground from below looking up. So above in the blue, you see the canopy has a more or less continuous structure. And I imagine there's probably a way to test for the randomness of that, but it looks pretty non-random to me. Whereas from below, you see there are targets that are spread throughout the entire volume of the canopy. Probably, arguably, more random. But anyway, the point is that they're quite different. The approaches that you use from above cannot necessarily be used from below, and vice versa. Here's some statistics on those two traces. The top left panel shows you the frequency distribution of the distances measured from the crane. You can see they're highly biased towards where the sensor is. But that's not just because they're apparent, because one target blocks another, but also because it's looking at this surface. Whereas from below, that's the panel to the bottom left, you can see, again, the target distribution is biased towards the position of the sensor. You can look at the autocorrelation of those, my approach to looking at the randomness of it, and what you can see is that from above, the autocorrelation decays at a much broader spatial scale than it does inside. So the correlation distance, if you will, is on the order of 5 or 10 meters from above, which is about the size of most crowns, whereas inside, it's on the order of 10, 20 centimeters, on the order of leaf sizes. And again, I want to contrast these two views, and in black and white, you see the contour graph of the location and the density of surface area in a 100-meter transect at a forest very close to my office. And I have overlaid upon it, in red line, an example of what the outer canopy surface would look like. And remember, it's the outer canopy surface that the airborne scanning LIDAR is seeing. They're not seeing the material below it. In that particular case, when you combine the information on all of the surfaces inside, you get the blue distribution. It tends to be a little choppy if you only have 100 meters of sample. As the sample size gets much larger, this distribution begins to look quite a bit smoother. The outer canopy surface, however, this is the cumulative distribution that I spoke of, the hypsograph, sees surfaces at a variety of depths, but nothing below them. So you can get all kinds of measurements from these systems, and some of the measurements are the same between the two. First of all are measurements of stature, which is just bulk, height. And you can measure the outer canopy heights, a variety of them, their maximum and the mean. Airborne laser scanning folks often use the distribution of surfaces, and they choose one that has the best correlation with the characteristic that they're interested in. Typically, it's the 95, 98th percentile height. Turns out that that correlates extremely well with the biomass of the forest. Or you can look at the stature of all the surfaces. Again, the mean and the maximum and the distribution. And I think I've just showed you that at least the distributions can be quite different between those two views. Texture. Very few people are thinking about texture, but we think it might have some significance for things like aerodynamic properties of forests. The texture of the outer canopy is related to something called the roughness of the canopy. The more elements that you have poking up in a variety of heights, the greater will be the capacity to reduce wind velocity with height in the forest. So that's what I call the rugosity, and it's simply the standard deviation of the local height. You can also measure the scale of that variation. I haven't actually found a great use for that yet, except for description. And there's a variety of statistical approaches to doing that. Now let me talk about a couple of applications of this technology. I'm really talking about the ground-based LIDAR here. I want to talk about a study of forests as they get older, the chronosequence at CERC. We have a number of stands. I think we had 50 or so at one point, all in this one type of forest called the tulip poplar type. And the stands were matched for everything we could think of. They spanned a large range of ages. We used the biomass. We estimated the biomass using local allometry equations and made lots and lots of measurements. Let me just show you what this chronosequence looks like. Here's a young forest about 25 years old. Here's one about 70, and here's one about 130 years old. They have a well-defined progression in species composition and biomass and structure as well. Let me just show you some examples of forests that are very, very young in that chronosequence. Here's one that I've been measuring every year. It's a very young stand, very boring. Most ecologists wouldn't bother because it just has tens of thousands of stems per hectare of this one species, liquid ambar. But it's interesting to me because it changes on an annual basis in its vertical structure. So these panels all show the amount of surface area density per unit height as you go up into the forest. And what you can see is that every year there's been an increase in the shape, the mode, and the spread of the canopy structure. I've noticed in the last couple of years it seems to have slowed down somewhat. Anyway, if you look at the difference over these 6 year differences, you can see this pattern that I've seen in lots of places. It looks a little bit like a sine wave that's traveling vertically. So you have heights where material is being added, and you have heights where material is being lost. I haven't found a way to use that in the model yet, but here's an example of 10 stands in the chronosequence which show the overall pattern of structural changes with time. And they're arranged from the top left to the bottom right with age. And what we typically see in our chronosequence is that young forests have an intensely high concentration of material very, very close to the ground. In fact, it's very dark in those forests. With time, the mean height increases, but so does the spread. After about 40 or 50 years, we have the appearance of an understory in our forest. The understory is both shade-tolerant species that will stay in the understory, but also the shade-tolerant young of those species that will eventually get into the canopy. This two-layered structure continues for a while, and then in the very oldest stages, we think the one at the bottom right is a potential old-growth forest. You have material at all heights. That's partially a feature of averaging, because old-growth forests have places which are young and places which are old and places which are intermediate. But if you average them all together, you get this structure with material at all levels. We can calculate the biomass for each of those stands. And here is an accumulation curve showing how the biomass increases from the earliest stages to the old stages. The error bars are forests where we actually had replicates measured at that age. You can see we have this general pattern which others have seen, an initially steep rise, followed by a tailing off. So the young forests don't have much biomass, but they're putting it on fairly rapidly, whereas the old forests have lots, but they're not growing very fast. And we can use the biomass that we can estimate the biomass of these stands using a very simple one of the LIDAR metrics that we use. And that's the mean of the local outer canopy height. In fact, several height metrics will work to do that prediction, but this one is the one that consistently does a better job. And this is a pretty tight curve. Other sorts of remote sensing tend to saturate, but LIDAR does not. So we're using this now for making aerial estimates of sites that we have not gone in and done this study for, because all you really need is this mean LOCH measurement. There are some textural differences too as those forests get older, and here I have a group of 4, a young and intermediate, mature and old growth. So roughly 15 years, 65 years, 120 years, and something over 250. And you can see how the texture changes with time. Note that the scale on the very, very young forest is quite a bit different than it is on the others. And if it were the same as the others, you would see it be relatively flat. So with time, you can see that not only does the forest get taller, but it gets more complicated above. And also the nature of the horizontal variation also changes. And I use the autocorrelation coefficient for this, and you find that the young forests, the autocorrelation decays quite rapidly, and then the intermediate forests, it gets a little larger, and the mature larger than that, and then the old growth is even larger. And this reflects what we know about the scale of the processes causing that structure, right? As the forest gets older, not only do the individual crowns get larger, but when the trees die, so do the holes. So this structure is contributed not just by things that are there, but also by things that are missing. In fact, if you use the hypsograph, which is the cumulative top height distribution in the forest, you can see some interesting patterns. The hypsograph is the cumulative distribution of heights. And in these panels, I have the hypsograph and the replicates that we measured from each of these 4 spans. So the young forest, the hypsograph pretty flat. In other words, most of the crowns are at the same height. As the forest gets older, that flatness, it decays somewhat, but the level of the hypsograph goes up because the forest has grown. You'll notice that there's some very, very low levels because those are little gaps. And with additional growth, what you have is increasing in the total maximum height, but an increasing fraction of those gaps. These, I think, are nice signatures for the stage of the forest development. And this works in both broadleaf forests and in the few cases that I've measured of conifer forests as well. Now, we can put all those together in a kind of a descriptive picture. And what I would suggest is that we have kind of 2 phases in forest development, using that hypsograph as a descriptor. On the left side, what you can see is the hypsograph gets progressively taller. In other words, what might be happening biologically is that the hypsograph is flat because the trees are competing with each other, but they're also growing. And then at one phase, the erosion phase, I'll call it, what you have is the creation of gaps, lots of them, and so the hypsograph starts to change in its shape, where you have a fair amount of material near the ground. Now I'll talk about an experiment at CERC where we had a logging event. Actually, it was in the middle of one of my large plots that I was studying. So after I got over the dismay, we decided to take advantage of the fact that this forest was recovering and we could make some interesting measurements to see what was happening. So the logging event happened over one winter. 50% of the basal area was removed. mostly in one species, our fastest growing, most valuable species, tulip poplar. We made annual measurements of a bunch of things that people are interested in forests. The transmittance of photosynthetically active radiation. If you know that, you know something about how much light the canopy is taking up. The gap fraction, which was measured with my system. The vertical structure, also measured with our system. The leaf area index. And I won't talk about the actual growth of the trees, but we made those measurements with dendrometer bands. Here's what the mature forest looks like at CERC. It turns out that the logging happened in both mature forests and intermediate forests. This is what the intermediate forest looked like right after the logging. But our forests seem to respond very quickly. So this is the previous scene a year later. And then here it is 2 years later. I recently tried to take more photographs of this site to show you the recovery visually, but it's so thick now that the picture is blocked with leaves. So it's a very vigorous system, and so you can study recovery in a fairly rapid period. We had an experimental design. We had both intact and logged forests of two types, intermediate and the mature phase. And we had 2 examples of each. And we studied them each in 1 hectare of land, and they're all distributed in the forest in CERC property. Here's an example of the effect of the logging itself. So the top 2 panels show the intermediate, the younger aged forests, and the bottom 2 panels show the mature one. On the left top, you can see what the forest looked like that's not cut. And then on the panel on the right, you can see what happened to the corresponding forest the year after it was cut. Sort of the differences between those 2 height profiles tells you something about how much canopy structure was removed. In fact, that's closely related to how much wood was removed from the site. You have a similar pattern down below with the mature forest. Again, the comparison between the intact and the logged. The reason for the big difference between these 2 is the mature forest was actually harvested a little bit more intensely than the intermediate ones. It had bigger trees too. Here's an example of the year-to-year changes in the forest. In this case, we have the intact mature one from the first year of 2008 to 2014. Again, I'm sampling along the same transects in each case. And there's really not much difference over these seven individual years. Some little differences that might have to do with gaps. Some may have to do with differences in the way the LIDAR moved from one side to another. But in general, I see they're all pretty similar. Here's a similar sequence, though, for the logged forests for that 7-year sequence. And these are all, by the way, in the same scale. And what you can see is the log forests, which had a lot of material removed at all heights, has shown a remarkable increase in the amount of material close to the ground. In fact, in 2013 and 14, it's extremely dark in those forests now. I presume that later on, that bulge will move up, and there'll be some lateral growth from the intact trees as well. But it'll take a long time, I think, before this forest recovers the structure of the previous one. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we measured a bunch of things that our PCL system can help with. And I want to show you how those relate to other things that are of interest. So in the top 2 panels, we have the gap fraction, the fraction of the overhead occasions where you actually could see sky. The mature, that's the red, and the intermediate forests, that's the blue, are very dark. In fact, our mature forests only allow around 1% to 2% of the light to penetrate, and the intermediate ones, it can be 3% to 5%. The log forests, which were extremely open to start with, 50% and more, depending on what kind, have recovered steadily in the gap fraction, so that right now, this last year, they were indistinguishable in some cases from the intact forest. The amount of light that penetrates is extremely closely related to the gap fraction, which makes some sense, but they are independent measurements. And finally, we have the leaf area index. This is measured by collecting the leaves and then sorting them to the species and then applying species-specific conversion factors between the weight of the leaves and the area of the leaves. I haven't measured the 2014 yet, but what we can see is the intact forests are pretty constant from year to year, but the logged forests are recovering nicely. So these are things that we want to know about forests. You know, how are they recovering in their capacity to take up light? How are they recovering in their capacity to produce leaves? And a lot of these things are very closely related to what we can measure with a simple LIDAR. And a lot of these different aspects have well-developed theories to relate them. For example, the Beer-Lambert law relates par penetrance to leaf area index. And just to show you here, here's the relationship between the gap fraction measured with the LIDAR and the amount of light that comes in. I call that ZPP for zenithal par penetrance because I correct them all to as though the sun were overhead. I can't make them all at the same time, so. But anyway, you can see that there's a very close relationship between the gap fraction and the light. And since light's fairly hard to measure, the PCL could stand in for making those measurements. Now let me talk briefly about this global survey that Martin alluded to. I'm not going to show a whole lot of analysis of that, but I just want to point out that this is something that I'm continuing to do. In fact, part of the reason for this trip is to make a measurement in a forest to Chibougamau. I hope I pronounced that right. In the next couple of days. So, so right now I'm just talking about potential. This is the current distribution of sites in the world. Of course, we're trying to get one now up there. Well, you know where you are. The idea is to try and sample as many forest types as you can. And depending on how you define forest types, I think we've sampled about half the type that exists. So I'm trying to fill that in. But it's hard to find the funds to do that. Just to show you, this is, some of those sites had cranes. And this is an example of the different kinds of texture that you can see from a crane looking down. And these are 4 separate forests. The one on the top left is Wind River, which is an old-growth Douglas fir forest in southern Washington state. We have a mixed species deciduous forest in the top right, and the other 2 are deciduous forests as well. But they indicate something about the diversity of textures that you can see throughout the world, and this is one of the things that I'd like to be able to report on with this project. Here's an example of one of these horizontal sections that I spoke of in a very, very short forest on the Pacific coast of Mexico. Believe it or not, this is an old-growth forest, but because it's extremely water stressed for about half the year, it doesn't grow very tall and it doesn't grow very fast. Here's a plantation of red pine measured at Harvard Forest, and you can see this forest is doing what a plantation should. It's got all its material at one height, all the trees are competing extremely ardently, and they're producing lots of wood. Martin will be interested in this. This is actually the tallest forest in the world. This is old-growth redwoods in Bull Creek Flats in Northern California. And you can see that the LIDAR instrument can see surfaces to as high as 95 meters above the ground. Curiously, even though the individual trees that do this are kind of unitary, they're broken apart from each other, when you look at the canopy this way, you can see it looks more like a porous structure. I was able to get biomass estimates from some of my colleagues at some of those sites. And this is an example of the global estimator of above ground biomass from a simple measurement of canopy height. Again, the local outer canopy height. This regression is highly influenced by these two outliers, but I suspect that when I fill this in, it'll look fairly similar. And this can be useful, I think, if we go to using satellites, such as ISAT, ISAT-2, and several others that are in development for predicting the biomass of the whole world. So I'd like to summarize this by contrasting some of the differences between the kinds of LIDAR systems that we've seen. So on the columns are airborne laser scanning and mine, the portable canopy LIDAR. And the scale at which they work is quite different. Airborne laser scanning can get you hundreds of thousands sometimes of square kilometers. And it's a great thing. You can make wonderful maps and you can get information about landscape transitions, and it's very useful, especially for management. My system is extremely local. It's a sampling device, and in general, I sample only a kilometer or two in each stand. The geometry of the sampling, again, is aerial in one case and it's linear in the other. The resolution, although airborne scanning LIDAR can sometimes have as many as 20 or 30 hits in a particular square meter, usually it's sampled so that you get one, or the average of one. In my case, the resolution of my instrument is on the order of centimeters or less, but I also aggregate those to meter bins. Airborne laser scanning, and this is my main point here, is all about surface features. And even if the surface is complex, it's still the surface. Whereas my system is all about the internal structure. And a couple other differences, this time relative to the metrics provided by the systems. Stature, both systems can give you the stature of the outer canopy. In fact, in cases where I make my measurements and airborne systems were available for overhead, the measure of the outer canopy height is very close. Surface texture, both systems can get it. Mine is one-dimensional, whereas airborne laser scanning is two-dimensional. Vertical structure, both can get the outer canopy, but only my system can get the interior. Cover and gap traction are both available. And then, of course, internal complexity, and there's a bunch of measurements of that, are not really available to the airborne material, but they are available to the ground-based LIDAR. So if you're interested in the kinds of things that need an answer over a large area and don't really require information on what's going on inside, then airborne laser scanning is the tool for you. If you are interested in things that are going on inside the canopy, habitat for organisms, animals in particular, local measurements of complexity, the vertical structure of all the surfaces, then the PCL instrument is probably your choice. Obviously, there are cases where we want to know both of those things. So we would have the large area sampling from the ALS and the local detailed sampling from the ground-based system. So I think I made these points over and over, but so LIDAR is useful. What you get depends on the kind of system, the way it's deployed, its geometry, and also the structure of the canopy, particularly the peculiar structure of the skin on the outer part of the forest. These systems can be deployed together and they will produce information that is complementary. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Anybody have questions for Geoffrey?
Yes?
Well, I did send out a related topic. I saw an article, I believe, a few years ago in the Washington Post. It was a big full-page thing. It was about I believe some of your work with like the largest individual tree fouling or something of that order. Can you explain that?
Well, they did get me for the Washington Post once, but it had to do with this study of how forests change in time, not for a particularly large tree. That may have been somebody else.
Okay. Was it like dendrometer bands being called?
What we discovered in that article was that using that the biomass curve that in the chrono sequence, that general pattern of fast growth and then slow, we were able to use that as the sort of standard or the expected pattern for a particular stand. We went back and measured a number of those stands numerous times, sometimes over 23 years, and we discovered that most of the individual stands were growing a lot faster than that overall trajectory would suggest. Therefore, something odd was happening regionally in terms of growth. That's what we got the attention for.
My question related to the presentation, I think you make a good case for how it's an excellent, these tools are excellent for describing forest structure and all. What's less clear to me is how it integrates or can integrate into modeling endeavors. Can you address that at all?
Well, I have hopes that this information will be integrated into modeling. The thing is, most of the models to date, forest models, regional models, and global ones, have not taken advantage of this detail of structure. Now that it's available, I expect folks will start to incorporate that. In fact, Martin is doing that himself, starting with the canopy model developed in California, which has some detailed characterization of canopies. There is another model called ED, Ecosystem Demography, that takes explicit account of the spatial variation in structure in order to make better aggregates of functions over space. Previously, the way that had been dealt with is you take the average structure and you produce the average function from it. There's hope that if you take clear and specific account of the variation, you'll get a better view of what's going on. And there's a couple of reasons for doing that, and that's because there's some really important nonlinearities involved in some aspects of structure and some aspects of function. So simple averaging may not help out that much.
And do you see related to growth and yield modeling ultimately?
Maybe. I have to admit, I don't know a whole lot about those. I think the issue with a lot of growth and yield models is that the canopy structural measures tend to focus on at the individual crown bases. The LIDAR scans are often exploited to see if you can identify individual trees and by their crown widths and the relationship between that and the height and the diameter. And then I guess by repeat surveys, calibrate your model. But I really don't know that much about growth and yield models. Yes?
I know you wanted to talk about the transect-based sampling, but I was struck by the detailed isoplasts of height in the aerial structures, the aerial sampling. I wondered, has anyone tried to identify the locations of maxima and apply some of the point process work that Ripley developed decades ago, talk about tree distances and such?
No, but that's a great idea. It's a great idea. There is a little problem with representing my data as contour graphs. And one of the problems is that when two voxels have very high surface area density, the contouring program tends to connect them, but we don't actually know if those things are part of the same object. We can guess. I mean, it's pretty clear sometimes you've intercepted a branch, but you don't know that for sure. So we'd have to do something about that problem before we apply a Ripley type analysis. But it's a great idea, especially because it's a two-dimensional field. One thing that may be important though is that in a sense it's not stationary. What's going on at the very top of that picture, I think is probably a little bit different than what's going on below. But it would be nice to see what a Ripley type coefficient extracts from that. Yes?
A more technical question. On the data acquisition with the PCL, how the positions of each measurement is taken account?
Well, I'm fairly lax with that. I tend to make my transects fairly short, and I pride myself on having a fairly constant pace, but that's clearly not true. And people who are more worried about that turn their sampling into like 10-meter transects and basically make individual files that they stitch together subsequently. There's a bunch of ways of doing that. I'm less concerned about it because I still think of my system as a sampling. I'm more interested in the statistics I extract from them than knowing exactly what's going on. On the other hand, I have done those time height sections for a forest that was cut. I didn't show it here. And then you see, 7 years of recovery. And the individual features are very close to the same place. So in my case, I think I've got the registration pretty good. Now, in some forests on hills, or with a lot of stumps in the way, or with a lot of branches, or mangrove forests, that'll be a real challenge. But people have solved it in a variety of ways. Any other questions?
No? Well, thank you very much.
I just, something I didn't quite get, or something that puzzles me about the density of measurements, the resolution of the depth that you showed from Washington, I guess it was, and the high density of, the low density of canopy gaps, the low penetration of the surface. So how can you reliably get
The ground?
ground height when you can't see it?
So that is a problem, but a general problem in airborne laser scanning. Your typical ground penetration is about 1/10 of a percent. 1/10 of a percent of the hits hit the ground. You have the problem of defining where the ground is. But there are a variety of routines. I think I'm aware of 7 different approaches to interpolating those hits that you think are ground into a good ground surface model. And they've been tested against known elevation points, and they work pretty well. Now, there are circumstances where they don't work really well. If you have built up things like culverts and bridges and bizarre structures that people have done, they tend to fail. But still, with that, with the few amounts of hits, the DEMs produced by that are way better than anything else available. In fact, the US FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency, is now mapping all the coastal states with LIDAR in order to get better flood maps. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Well, if there's no more questions, thanks a lot for coming.
That's really cool stuff. One of my supervisors back when I was starting to work with air photos and texture measurements.
Yeah.
I don't see it. It's still it's in the beast.
You can get them from there. Lines, take advantage of the shadow.
Yeah.
People do that. But yeah, there's a huge and a well-developed field of texture measurement for engineering,
Computer graphics.